Today, I'm talking about the Nazca people. And this was a civilization that existed in Peru almost 2,000 years ago. So the guesstimate is 100 BCE to about 7 or 800 CE. It's really hard to pinpoint, their first day of school and then their graduation. There's a lot of blurred lines in between. And you might be familiar with the Nazca because they often get talked about for the Nazca Lines. You'll see this on like Ancient Aliens and conspiracy theories, where this is the culture that perfectly drew animals in the desert that you could see from outer space to land your spaceship. When in fact, that's not true at all. We'll talk about it. You can make your own judgment. But they were a very creative and fascinating people. At the peak of their civilization, it's guessed it was about 25, 30,000 people existed in the Nazca River Valley. So they didn't just come to be with the snap of the fingers. It was a migration of the Paracas people who existed on the western coast of Peru on a peninsula for about 800 years. That culture survived, and then ultimately rising sea levels caused many of them to move inland, and they took some of their customs and other cultural beliefs and became what we know as the Nazca people. The environment in which they lived in was pretty harsh. It was desert. It's not like when you think of Peru, you think of the mountainous region, the northern Andes, like Machu Picchu. It wasn't like that. Yes, there were mountains and hills, and there was a river valley where there was a lot of greenery around the river for some time, but it was mostly barren desert, cobble, and rocks. So it was a grind to live there. So how did people like that survive for so long? And what kind of drugs were they using? And why is it important to talk about? I think it's hugely important. And at the end of this episode, you can make your own determination of why the Nazca Lines exist and how the use of drugs influenced some of the creativity in their culture. So other than that, they were a family system that were farmers, and they had trade, and they were artisans. There was extensive trade routes from the Amazonian people into the region, and of course, the Andean people and northern regions and tribes in South America. So trade was well established, which allowed for them to spread their creative pottery and their fabrics and their crops to other civilizations, and of course, bring in things like drugs, which we are certainly going to highlight. But because it was a desert area and they were a farming culture, they needed to figure out creative ways to get water. And you can still see some of the wells that they had constructed. They still exist today. They were very creative. They tapped into the side of the hills to reach the water table, and then they were able to transport the water into these creative wells that you can still see all over the region. It's absolutely fascinating, the ingenuity that went behind it. You can go in, I'm talking about you, into Google Earth on your phone and zoom into this area of Peru. It's so bare, and it looks like Tatooine, like Star Wars. If you remember Luke Skywalker, he lived in this like desert planet. It looks a lot like that. So you can just sit around and ancient structures or the remains of them, the foundations that were built in rocks, because that area didn't see a lot of rain. So there wasn't like significant weather or that just changed the way it looked. So what you saw 1,000 years ago probably looks very similar today, maybe some windblown sand over it, but it's fascinating. And you can see the amount of looting that goes on at these ancient sites as well. It looks like the moon. There's all these craters in it. But often at my daughter's hockey practice, and this is, you got to ask yourself, what level on the nerd scale are you? And I'm pretty high. I'll sit there and just zoom in, not just this part of Peru. I do it in all parts of the world. It's fascinating what you can see. And you see things that yet haven't been discovered by man because there's no roads there. They're not on any registry or log, or it's not a park, and you'll just find a dwelling or a structure in the middle of nowhere. And I think it's fascinating. So these desert people were very spiritual because their purpose for living was to pray for water and fertility. And we know that from the amount of artifacts that have been left behind. So they were so spiritual because the land was so hard that they had a lot of ceremonies. And at the center of the Nazca region, there was a place called Kuhachi, which was, early discoveries thought it was a big, giant, ancient city. But in the last couple decades, it's been identified as a spiritual temple. There was no sign of sustained living there, but there was burial sites with, dozens of bodies and, of course, a lot of ceremonial stuff, bulk plateware and pottery and other items of history that would basically help you understand that people gathered here in large numbers. And they did that because they had to pray for water all the time. And in some of their fabric, when it shows the shamans that would lead their prayer, you can see what they're wishing for. And you know how they did that? With the help of drugs. They would trade for the San Pedro cactus, which came from northern South America regions. And this cactus had mescaline in it, essentially. They would scrape off the side of the cactus and just leave like the green skin. They would boil it and they would drink it. And then for 10 to 12 hours, it was hallucinogenic. They had this like psychedelic experience. And they were led by a shaman in a culture whose not only purpose, was fertility and water. So everything they did, the significance of these hallucinogenic trips, right? Like just think of like the Grateful Dead and an LSD journey was really just in prayer to ask the gods for more water. And their gods and deities and the things that they held their beliefs so strongly to were like giant cats, shrimp, spiders, hummingbirds, monkeys, whales. It's so amazing, the artwork that you see on their pottery. And they use these vibrant colors and these designs, as you can tell, they're just remarkable and so creative. And these people weren't influenced by social media or TV. All they had was stories from other people, and then how far they could expand the limits of their mind when they're on a psychedelic journey using mescaline from the cactus. They also consumed something called chicha, which was a strong alcohol that was cooked and boiled with spices and other ingredients and corn or maize mash that they drank at these ceremonies. So there's evidence of the chicha in their own personal dwellings far from this Kuhachi temple region. So it's possible it wasn't just for ceremony, but the San Pedro cactus is depicted in some of these fabrics and on the pottery. Because, cultures like this, they don't have a written language. They didn't like write instructions. In ancient Egypt, we understand some of their opium use because we discovered the Ebers papyrus, which was just them writing in hieroglyphics like, hey, use opium to stop a baby from crying. But we didn't have those instructions from this type of culture. So how did we know the purpose of the drug use, the depiction on the pottery and the fabric, but also they sacrificed people in these ancient ceremonies? Now, we cannot judge them because they sacrificed not just young men, but women and children, because that's how strong their conviction was and their beliefs that they needed to give something significant to the gods so that it would rain or they would find more water or whatever it is they needed to keep their civilization going. So by consuming this alcohol drink, chicha, and the mescaline, they would also go out into the desert. And this is where the Nazca Lines come in. Now, you can see them from above if you're on an airplane, and it's pretty extraordinary, the images and shapes, right? Perfect, like the monkey or the shrimp or the whale or the cat. And some researchers have shown on some of the perfect drawings, there's always an entrance and an exit, which is a symbol that, or a sign that you can walk through it. Other researchers came down in the last 10 years and they did some testing on the soil, right? Which would essentially look like a path you're walking on. You can't see the shapes from the ground. You can only see them from above, which makes it fascinating. But they tested that soil, and what they came up with was that it was so hard packed. It was almost like it was a city road, essentially, meaning so many people traveled on it, which would go hand in hand with their use of mescaline and marching in a ceremony fashion on a pilgrimage through the desert. Just imagine them chanting and marching, perhaps dancing, large numbers of people through these shapes, whether it was the monkey or the cat. to help get attention or to please the gods. Now, it wasn't just these big shapes that you see. There was thousands of lines. In fact, it looked like they didn't care about the work of others, and they weren't done by one generation. The work was done over hundreds of years, and they would just kind of make a line over somebody else's line, which is fascinating because they could not see it from above. Now, we know how they built these lines because along the paths, they found wood and rope, which is what you would use today in like a basic surveying technique to make things perfect and for measurements. So it was easy to understand that. And you can see the rock, it was cobbled. They just moved it to the side. You and I could go there through a spot that hasn't been cleared out, move some cobble to the side, make our own shape, and go back in 30 years. It's still going to look like that because it doesn't rain there. The environment doesn't change. So whatever you make is essentially going to stay there. So it must have been quite an extraordinary scene with all their vibrant colors and their emotion. And then they're being led by a shaman on these psychedelic trips. And they already hold the shaman in high regard. So now the shaman is guiding them and influencing the people beyond the regular mind's ability to think and be creative into a level of consciousness that's like, let's face it, it's like the Doors in the desert on peyote, right? Jim Morrison. So it had to be incredible. But if you look at the other creativity and the things they do in their culture, one has to think that this use of substances, like at least the psychedelic ones, get them to think so creative in their beliefs that yes, drawing lines in the desert by moving the cobble to the side will get the attention to the gods. It's nothing to do with landing spaceships, but they also did some other creative stuff that might have been influenced to where their mind goes after using psychedelics for so long. They would have something called trophy heads, where they would cut the head off a dead person. And it doesn't look like this was war or enemies because we don't find in the research evidence of war, right? Everything, like all the heads severed, are like clean cuts, like somebody was dead or it was a sacrifice and it was done purposely and clean, not like signs of battle or injury. And then they would drill a hole through it and put rope through it, and then sometimes put metal stakes through it to hold the look a face had. And you can see in these images that the priests are carrying these heads around. And sometimes these heads are buried with other Nazca people. They also were a culture that did elongated heads. So at birth, they would wrap the skull while it was still malleable or pliable, right? So you would grow up with a long skull. They do this in a lot of cultures around the world, but some TV shows will come in and be like, look, we found a long skull human, and these Nazca Lines calling aliens, they must be an alien culture. And that's just not true. It was just the way that the elite class marked themselves, much like in some tribes in Northern Africa would put a plate in their tongue or expand their ears. It was just a status symbol. So they had these trophy heads, they had these elongated heads. And then on their textiles and their pottery, the designs of these animals is so creative and colorful. They also used mummy bundles. So the way they buried their dead was they sat up here and they wrapped them in rope and cloth, and they buried them sitting up with things next to them in the fashion of ancient Egypt that told the story of their lives. So obviously, the more high in society you were, the more elaborate the things you were buried with are. And then, of course, we talked about they did sacrifice of women and children. And because the bodies are so well preserved. I mean, the fact you can find wood in this site from a couple thousand years ago is amazing. And that's because the arid desert keeps everything intact. Normally a piece of wood would just, it disappear over 100 years, but they are able to find things like the mummies, as I was saying, they have hair on them. So they are able to go in, do DNA, hair sample tests, other types of scientific experience to determine that this drug use existed because they can see it in the test results of these mummies. So it wasn't just the drawings, it was the actual evidence that they failed their drug test 1,000 years later. So this culture using a lot of drugs existing in the desert for a long time, but by being creative with their engineering to build these complex water systems, they really had it going on for a South American culture that was using LSD, a psychedelics, mescaline, and drinking chicha. Eventually, the Waray people would move in and overtake the Nazca people, and they'd blend into a new culture that would also bring in coca, right? And this is what we make cocaine paste out of, that the cartels love to ship up north and sell to all the American people. So drugs in this society, very prevalent, just like a lot of ancient civilizations, but their use of it expanded their creative minds. So we still have these amazing gifts of history we can look at today. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time on History on Drugs.
One, two, the, one, two, the,